In 2010, in San Diego, California, Daniel Brooks stood at a point in life that felt both settled and incomplete. At 41, he had already experienced a full cycle of adulthood, marriage, fatherhood, and the quiet unraveling that led to divorce. His two sons were growing into their own lives, old enough to need less guidance but still close enough to remain the center of his daily routine. Daniel had built a life defined by responsibility, structure, and quiet persistence. What he had not rebuilt until that year was the sense of emotional connection he once believed was gone for good. It began during a local community event, the kind that brought together people from across the neighborhood without expectation. It was not designed to change lives. It was simply one of those ordinary American gatherings built around food, small conversations, and the illusion of slowing time for a few hours. Daniel had attended out of habit more than enthusiasm, accompanying his sons, expecting nothing beyond a brief distraction from routine. Melissa Carter had arrived from a different direction in life. At 32, she had recently relocated to Southern California after years of trying to restart following a serious accident in her early 20s. That accident had quietly reshaped her future in ways few people around her fully understood. It had taken away her ability to have children, something she had once assumed would naturally become part of her life. Instead, she had built independence, stability, and resilience, but there remained an unspoken absence beneath everything she did. Their meeting was not dramatic. It did not rely on coincidence dressed as destiny. It was simply recognition. Two people noticing each other in a moment when neither expected anything significant. Over time, what began as familiarity became consistency. What became consistency turned into trust. And within that trust, both Daniel and Melissa found something neither had planned for: a renewed sense of possibility. Their relationship developed with a quiet certainty. There were no abrupt shifts, no exaggerated turning points. Instead, it grew through shared routines, small commitments, and a mutual understanding of what each had already lived through. Daniel did not need to explain the complexity of raising children after divorce. Melissa did not need to justify the guarded way she approached the idea of family. Each recognized the other's history without requiring it to be retold. By the time they married a few years later, their decision felt less like a leap and more like a natural continuation of something already firmly established. Their life together did not begin with adjustment, but with alignment. Melissa became part of a household that had already been shaped by years of structure, and rather than disrupt it, she strengthened it. Daniel's sons responded in a way that surprised even him. They did not resist Melissa's presence. They did not create distance or uncertainty. Instead, they accepted her with a level of openness that reflected how she treated them, with patience, consistency, and an emotional clarity that made her role unmistakable. Over time, the distinction between stepmother and parent faded. It was replaced by something simpler and more meaningful: a sense of belonging that required no explanation. For Melissa, this shift carried a deeper significance. The life she had once imagined, raising children of her own, had been quietly removed from her future years earlier. Yet within this new family, she found a different version of that same purpose. It was not a replacement, but it was real. It allowed her to give and receive the kind of connection she had thought might never fully return. Years passed in a steady rhythm. The family did not experience dramatic highs or devastating lows. Instead, their life reflected something more common, yet often overlooked: stability. The kind of stability that builds over time through shared effort, mutual respect, and the willingness to remain present even when nothing extraordinary is happening. Daniel continued working, providing consistency. Melissa maintained the emotional center of the home. The boys grew, gradually shifting from dependence to independence. Milestones came and went: graduations, new responsibilities, the early signs of adulthood forming in each of them. By the early 2020s, the structure that had defined their household began to change. The boys, now adults, prepared to move into their own lives. This transition was expected, even planned for, but it carried a weight that neither Daniel nor Melissa ignored. Their identity had been deeply tied to being parents. The approaching silence of an empty home represented not just change, but a redefinition of who they were as individuals. Still, they faced it together, and in that shared understanding, there was no sense of loss, only the recognition that life was moving into its next phase, just as it had before. What neither of them realized at that moment was how quickly that next phase would arrive, and how completely it would reshape everything they believed their future would become. Melissa's place in the Brooks family was never defined by obligation. It formed through consistency, and over time, consistency turned into something that no one questioned. The structure of the household did not shift dramatically when she entered it, but the emotional center of that structure began to change. Daniel had already built a routine focused on stability, but Melissa brought a different kind of presence, one that filled gaps that had never been clearly identified until they were no longer there. Daniel's two sons had grown up quickly after the divorce. They understood responsibility earlier than most, and they had learned to rely on their father in ways that left little room for uncertainty. When Melissa became part of their lives, there was no clear expectation of what her role would be. She did not attempt to redefine their family or claim authority in a way that would disrupt what already existed. Instead, she showed up in small, consistent ways that gradually reshaped how the boys saw her. She paid attention. She remembered details that others overlooked. She treated each moment as something that mattered, even when nothing significant was happening. That approach did not create immediate change, but it built trust. Over time, that trust became something more stable than any formal role could have provided. The boys did not begin calling her Mom because they were asked to. The shift happened quietly, without a defining moment. It reflected an understanding that had already formed beneath the surface. Melissa had become a constant in their lives, and the word they chose simply acknowledged what was already true. For Melissa, this acceptance carried a weight that she rarely expressed. Years earlier, after the accident that had altered her future, she had learned to live with a version of life that no longer included the possibility of raising children of her own. That loss had not defined her outwardly, but it had shaped her expectations. She had adjusted to the idea that certain experiences would remain out of reach. Being part of Daniel's family did not erase that history, but it gave her something she had not anticipated: a chance to experience connection in a way that felt complete. It was not about replacing what had been lost. It was about recognizing that meaning could still exist in a different form. Daniel saw the change, even if it was never directly addressed. He understood that Melissa had stepped into a role that required patience, and he recognized the impact it had on his sons. The stability he had worked to maintain was now supported by something deeper. It was no longer just about structure. It was about emotional presence, something he had not been able to fully provide on his own. The years that followed did not introduce dramatic conflict or unexpected disruption. Instead, they reinforced what had already been built. The family moved forward together, each person growing in ways that reflected both independence and connection. Daniel's sons developed their own identities, but they remained anchored to the household that had shaped them. Melissa continued to be a central part of that foundation. Her approach did not change over time. She remained consistent, attentive, and grounded. The absence she had once felt did not disappear, but it became less defining. It was replaced by something that carried equal significance: the ability to contribute to a family in a way that felt real and lasting. As the boys reached adulthood, their relationship with both Daniel and Melissa evolved. They no longer required the same level of guidance, but their connection did not weaken. It shifted into something more balanced, built on mutual respect rather than dependence. They still returned home regularly, still sought advice, still treated the space as something that belonged to them. For Daniel and Melissa, this transition marked a turning point. The routines that had defined their daily lives began to change. There were fewer shared obligations, fewer structured responsibilities. The house became quieter, not in a negative sense, but in a way that made the passage of time more noticeable. They had anticipated this shift. For years, they had discussed what life would look like once the boys moved on. It was not a conversation driven by uncertainty, but by preparation. They understood that their identity as parents would not disappear, but it would no longer define every part of their lives. That understanding allowed them to begin thinking about the future in a different way. They started to consider what they wanted beyond the role they had held for so long. The idea of change did not feel disruptive. It felt like a continuation of something they had already navigated successfully. Melissa approached this phase with the same mindset she had carried from the beginning. She did not focus on what was ending. She focused on what could still be built. The connection she had formed with Daniel and his sons remained intact, but she began to look toward the next stage with a sense of quiet intention. Daniel shared that perspective. He had spent years building stability for his family. Now, with his sons preparing to move fully into their own lives, he saw an opportunity to redefine his own path alongside Melissa. It was not about replacing the past. It was about recognizing that their future still held possibilities that had yet to be explored. What neither of them fully acknowledged was how much they were relying on the assumption that this next phase would unfold gradually, just as everything else had. They believed they had time to adjust, time to plan, time to move forward at their own pace. They had no reason to think otherwise. Everything in their lives had followed a steady progression. There had been challenges, but nothing that disrupted the overall direction they were moving in. That sense of predictability made what came next impossible to anticipate. By the time 2022 arrived, the transition Daniel and Melissa had anticipated for years finally became real. Their sons moved out within months of each other, stepping into independent lives shaped by careers, relationships, and the momentum of adulthood. The shift was not abrupt, but it was undeniable. The routines that once filled every day no longer required their presence, and the role that had defined them for so long began to change. They had prepared for this moment with a level of discipline that reflected how they had approached every major decision in their lives. For years, they had quietly set aside money, not in large amounts at once, but consistently. They adjusted spending, avoided unnecessary expenses, and built a financial plan centered around a single idea. When the house became empty, they would leave it behind and begin a different kind of life. That plan was not built on fantasy. It was grounded in practicality. Neither Daniel nor Melissa had ever lived extravagantly, and they had no intention of starting. Their goal was simple: reduce their needs, simplify their environment, and create a lifestyle that allowed them to focus on time rather than obligation. Selling the house in San Diego was the first step. The decision did not carry hesitation. It felt like a natural extension of everything they had discussed over the years. The house had served its purpose. It had been the foundation of their family, but it was no longer necessary for the life they were preparing to build. The sale provided the financial base they needed. Combined with their savings, it allowed them to move forward with a purchase they had spent years considering: a modest yacht that would become both their home and their primary means of living. The vessel they found was not impressive by conventional standards. It showed signs of age, required maintenance, and lacked the polished appearance often associated with that kind of lifestyle. But Daniel and Melissa did not view it through that lens. They saw it as something that could be shaped through effort, just as they had shaped every other part of their lives. They named it Second Horizon, a reflection of what it represented. It was not an escape from the past. It was a continuation, a deliberate choice to move forward into a new phase with intention. From the moment the purchase was finalized, they committed fully. They transferred their belongings, reduced what they owned to only what was necessary, and began the process of transforming the vessel into a livable space. Every adjustment was made within their limits, guided by practicality rather than ambition. They repaired what needed fixing, reorganized what already existed, and made gradual improvements that reflected their shared priorities. The process took months. It required patience and consistency, but it also reinforced something they had always relied on: working together toward a clear goal. There were no shortcuts, no external solutions. Everything was done step by step, using the resources they had carefully preserved. By mid-2022, the transformation was complete. The yacht did not stand out to anyone unfamiliar with it, but for Daniel and Melissa, it represented stability in a different form. It was functional, efficient, and entirely their own. Their new life began without ceremony. There was no clear starting point, only a gradual shift into a routine that replaced what they had left behind. They moved between coastal areas in Southern California and Baja, Mexico, following a pattern that balanced movement with familiarity. Their days were structured but flexible. They maintained responsibilities tied to navigation, maintenance, and daily needs, but those responsibilities were different from the obligations they had known before. Time was no longer divided by external demands. It was shaped by their own decisions. The lifestyle required adjustment. Living in a confined space meant constant awareness of resources, organization, and limitations. But those limitations aligned with the simplicity they had planned for. They did not experience the change as a loss. Instead, it reinforced the idea that they had reduced their lives to what truly mattered. They stayed connected to their sons through regular communication. The physical distance did not weaken those relationships. If anything, it clarified them. Conversations became more intentional, less routine, and more meaningful. Their role as parents had shifted, but it had not diminished. For Melissa, the new phase carried an additional layer of meaning. The life she had built with Daniel had always been grounded in family, and even as that structure evolved, her connection to it remained central. The absence of children in their immediate daily life did not create emptiness. It created space for a different kind of presence, one that was less defined by responsibility and more by choice. Daniel experienced a similar shift. The identity he had built as a provider and father had not disappeared, but it no longer required the same level of constant engagement. He began to view his role differently, not as something that needed to be maintained, but as something that had already been fulfilled. For 2 years, this rhythm remained consistent. There were no significant disruptions, no unexpected events that forced them to reconsider their path. They adapted to challenges as they arose, but nothing altered the overall direction of their lives. Their decisions had led them to a place of stability that was not dependent on location or routine. It was defined by their ability to adjust, to remain aligned, and to continue moving forward without losing sight of what they had built together. That sense of control made the next development feel like a choice rather than a necessity. When it came, it did not disrupt their plans immediately. Instead, it introduced a new factor, one that would eventually reshape everything, but at first seemed like a natural extension of the life they had already created. In early 2024, the shift began with a phone call that carried a different kind of weight than anything Daniel and Melissa had experienced in years. Their older son shared news that immediately reframed everything they had built over the past decade. He was expecting his first child. The announcement did not arrive as a surprise in terms of timing, but its impact was immediate and undeniable. It introduced a new role into their lives, one that neither of them had actively planned for, yet both understood deeply. For Daniel, the news brought a sense of continuity. It extended the family structure forward, connecting what he had built in the past to something that would carry on beyond him. For Melissa, the meaning was more layered. The idea of being close to a grandchild held a significance that reached back to a part of her life that had once been closed off. It was not about replacing what had been lost years earlier. It was about the opportunity to be present in a new way, to contribute to the life of a child who would grow up within the same structure she had helped create. Their life on the yacht had given them freedom, but it had also created distance. That distance had been manageable while their sons were independent adults, but the prospect of a new child shifted that balance. The idea of being physically present, of having access to everyday moments rather than occasional visits, became increasingly important. It was not driven by obligation. It was driven by a clear understanding of what they valued. The decision that followed did not emerge from impulse. It developed through the same methodical process they had applied to every major choice in their lives. They reviewed their situation, evaluated their priorities, and considered what adjustments would be necessary to align their current lifestyle with this new development. The conclusion became clear. If they wanted to be part of their grandchild's life in a meaningful way, they needed to return to land. Selling the yacht represented more than a financial transaction. It marked the end of a phase that had defined their identity for years. Second Horizon had been more than a vessel. It had been a deliberate expression of independence, a space that reflected their ability to redefine life on their own terms. Letting go of it required the same clarity that had led them to acquire it in the first place. They approached the process with precision. They prepared the yacht for sale, ensuring it reflected the care they had invested in it. They documented its condition, organized its features, and positioned it within the market in a way that would attract serious buyers. They placed an advertisement in a specialized maritime publication, setting the asking price at approximately $500,000. The number was not arbitrary. It was calculated based on their investment, the improvements they had made, and the value of similar vessels. The response came faster than expected. Within a short period, they were contacted by a couple from Orange County, Ryan Walker and Ashley Walker. The inquiry did not raise immediate concern. The buyers appeared motivated, financially capable, and prepared to move forward quickly. Their communication focused on logistics, specifications, and timing, consistent with what Daniel and Melissa had anticipated from serious interest. As the process moved forward, the interactions remained primarily transactional. There were no extended personal exchanges, no efforts to establish a deeper connection beyond what was necessary to complete the sale. This aligned with Daniel and Melissa's expectations. They had conducted enough negotiations in their lives to recognize efficiency when they saw it. A meeting was scheduled to allow the Walkers to evaluate the yacht in person and to proceed with a sea trial. The purpose was straightforward: confirm that the vessel met their expectations and finalize the terms of the purchase. The timeline was condensed, but not unusually so given the level of interest already established. Daniel informed his sons that the sale was nearing completion. The update was brief but carried a sense of finality. It signaled that their return to land was no longer a possibility under consideration. It was an imminent reality. They discussed potential locations, with a focus on areas that would place them within reach of their son and the upcoming birth. Their plan was to complete the transaction, secure housing, and transition into a new routine that balanced proximity to family with the independence they had maintained. Everything appeared aligned. The buyers were ready. The price had been agreed upon. The next steps were clearly defined. There was no indication that the process would deviate from what had been established. Daniel and Melissa approached the upcoming meeting with the same mindset that had guided them through every major transition. They relied on preparation, clarity, and the assumption that each party was acting within a shared framework of mutual benefit. The structure of the transaction left little room for uncertainty. What remained was execution. The meeting at the marina was set to take place within days. The expectation was simple: confirm the condition of the yacht, complete the documentation, transfer ownership, and move forward. At that moment, the decision to sell Second Horizon still felt like a continuation of their plan, not a turning point. Nothing in their experience suggested that this transaction would be any different from the others they had navigated throughout their lives. They had no reason to question it. They had no reason to anticipate what would follow. The final update Daniel and Melissa gave their sons was brief and precise. The buyers were confirmed, the price had been agreed upon, and the process would be completed within days. It was the kind of message they had sent many times before when closing one chapter and preparing for another. It carried confidence, clarity, and the assumption that everything was moving exactly as planned. After that call, there was silence. At first, the absence of contact did not trigger immediate concern. Daniel and Melissa had always maintained communication, but there were occasional gaps when they were handling logistics or moving between locations. Their sons expected a follow-up message confirming the sale had been completed and outlining their next steps. When a day passed without that update, it felt unusual but not alarming. By the second day, the pattern began to shift. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. The consistency that had defined Daniel and Melissa's behavior over the years was suddenly gone. They were not the kind of people who allowed time to pass without checking in, especially during a transition as significant as selling their primary residence. Concern escalated quickly because there was no reasonable explanation. Their sons tried multiple ways of reaching them, repeating calls at different times, sending messages through every available channel. Each attempt resulted in the same outcome: nothing. The situation reached a point where waiting no longer felt acceptable. Daniel's older brother, Michael Brooks, had spent decades in law enforcement before retiring. He was familiar with patterns, with the difference between a delay and a disruption. When he learned about the sudden loss of contact, he did not interpret it as a coincidence. He recognized it as a deviation from behavior that had been consistent for years. Michael drove to the marina where Second Horizon had been docked. His intention was simple: confirm whether Daniel and Melissa were still in the area or whether the sale had been completed. He expected to find clarity, even if the explanation turned out to be harmless. What he found did not provide that clarity. The yacht was still there, but it did not reflect the condition Daniel had always maintained. Michael had known his brother long enough to understand his standards. Daniel did not leave details unresolved. He did not overlook organization or maintenance. The vessel had always reflected that discipline. Now, the structure remained, but the consistency was gone. There were indicators that someone had been using the yacht, but not with the same attention to detail. Equipment that should have been secured was left out of place. Protective coverings had been removed but not restored. Items that would normally be organized had been left without order. These were not isolated oversights. They formed a pattern that suggested a change in control. Michael assessed the situation with the same methodical approach that had defined his career. The most straightforward explanation was that the sale had been completed and the new owners had taken possession. The differences in condition could be attributed to a different standard of care. That explanation accounted for the visible changes, but it did not address the absence of communication. He left a message for the new owners, identifying himself and requesting contact. His goal was to confirm the timeline of the transaction and determine when Daniel and Melissa had last been present. It was a practical step, grounded in the assumption that information would resolve the uncertainty. The response came quickly. Ashley Walker returned his call and confirmed that she and her husband had purchased the yacht. She stated that the transaction had been completed recently and that they had taken possession without issue. Her tone reflected cooperation rather than hesitation. She acknowledged that she had also attempted to contact Daniel and Melissa after the sale, citing questions about certain controls on the yacht and the discovery of personal items that had been left behind. Her explanation aligned with the surface-level evidence. It reinforced the idea that the sale had occurred as planned. But it also introduced another inconsistency. If Daniel and Melissa had received payment and completed the transfer, there was no logical reason for them to leave valuable belongings behind or become unreachable immediately afterward. Michael asked for specifics. He wanted to know the exact point at which the interaction had ended. Ashley stated that the last time they had seen Daniel and Melissa was at the conclusion of the transaction. According to her account, the money had been exchanged, the documentation had been signed, and Daniel and Melissa had left in their vehicle. The explanation was clear. It was also incomplete. Michael followed up by contacting Patricia Reynolds, the financial manager Daniel and Melissa had relied on during their time on the water. Her role had been consistent for years, handling bills, monitoring accounts, and ensuring that their financial structure remained intact even when they were not physically present. He asked a direct question. Had a deposit of approximately $500,000 been made? The answer was immediate. No such deposit had occurred. The absence of that transaction could not be explained by delay alone. A transfer of that size would have appeared within a defined time frame, especially given the urgency Daniel and Melissa had expressed in completing the sale and moving forward with their plans. The pieces no longer aligned. The yacht appeared to have changed ownership. The buyers confirmed the transaction. Yet the payment was missing, and Daniel and Melissa had effectively disappeared at the exact moment the sale was supposed to have been finalized. Michael did not attempt to rationalize the situation further. The pattern had shifted from unusual to concerning, and from concerning to something that required immediate attention. He contacted the Newport Beach Police Department and filed a missing persons report. The transition from uncertainty to investigation happened quickly. What had started as a delay in communication was now being treated as a potential criminal matter. The information available did not yet point to a clear conclusion, but it established a foundation of inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Daniel and Melissa had not followed their plan. They had not completed the next step they had clearly outlined. They had simply stopped. And in that absence, the situation began to take on a different meaning, one that could no longer be explained by coincidence or miscommunication. The investigation moved forward with a clear starting point. The last confirmed interaction Daniel and Melissa had was with the buyers, Ryan Walker and Ashley Walker. That fact alone placed the couple at the center of every initial question. Detectives began with standard procedure, building a timeline based on available statements and verifying each detail against known facts. Ryan Walker was brought in for questioning. His demeanor did not indicate resistance. He answered questions directly, providing a version of events that, on the surface, appeared consistent. He confirmed that he had contacted Daniel after seeing the listing, arranged a meeting, and proceeded with what he described as a standard purchasing process. According to him, the transaction had been completed in full. He stated that the payment had been made in cash, the necessary documents had been signed, and Daniel and Melissa had left the marina in their vehicle immediately afterward. The explanation was structured and delivered without hesitation. It included specific references to timing and sequence, suggesting preparation rather than improvisation. However, it did not address the growing list of inconsistencies already identified by investigators. One of the first discrepancies involved the method of payment. A transaction of that magnitude, conducted entirely in cash, was unusual but not impossible. When asked how he had obtained the funds, Ryan initially offered a vague explanation tied to past earnings. The statement lacked detail and did not align with available financial records. Under continued questioning, his explanation changed. He admitted that the money did not come from legitimate savings. Instead, he described it as funds he had taken years earlier from an illegal source and concealed until he could use them. His admission introduced a separate criminal issue unrelated to the disappearance, but it also provided context for the use of cash. The detectives noted the shift in his narrative. It indicated a willingness to adjust his account under pressure, which reduced the reliability of his earlier statements. At the same time, his cooperation in admitting to unrelated crimes complicated the situation. It created the appearance of transparency while leaving critical questions unanswered. Ashley Walker was interviewed separately. Her account matched Ryan's in its structure. She confirmed the meeting, the transfer of ownership, and the departure of Daniel and Melissa. She also mentioned her attempts to contact them after the sale, reinforcing the claim that their disappearance occurred after the transaction had been completed. Investigators extended their inquiry to include 2 additional individuals who had been present during the alleged transaction: a notary and a witness identified by Ryan as a friend. Both individuals provided statements that aligned with the version of events already described. According to their accounts, Daniel and Melissa had willingly completed the sale, accepted the payment, and left without indication of concern. At this stage, the case reached a temporary standstill. Multiple individuals were repeating the same sequence of events. Their statements supported each other, creating a unified narrative that, if taken at face value, suggested that Daniel and Melissa had disappeared on their own after completing a legitimate transaction. However, the evidence did not support that conclusion. The missing deposit remained unexplained. The absence of financial activity following the sale contradicted the claim that Daniel and Melissa had taken possession of the payment. Their vehicle had been located in Arizona, not under their control, but connected to Ryan Walker. Personal belongings had been found in locations that did not align with a planned departure. Each of these elements represented a deviation from what would be expected if the transaction had occurred as described. Investigators recognized that the consistency in the statements they had received did not necessarily indicate truth, could also indicate coordination. They returned to the details, focusing on what could be independently verified. The documentation related to the sale became a point of interest. The signatures appeared valid, but the circumstances under which they had been obtained were unclear. The timeline suggested by the statements did not fully align with the sequence of events that could be confirmed through external sources. The case required a shift in approach. Rather than accepting the shared narrative, detectives began testing it. They revisited each individual involved, not to collect new information, but to challenge the existing accounts. The goal was to identify inconsistencies that had not been apparent during the initial interviews. The notary, who had previously presented herself as a neutral participant, became a focal point. Her role was to validate the authenticity of the transaction. If her involvement was legitimate, it would support the claim that the sale had been conducted properly. If not, it would undermine the entire structure of the narrative. Under renewed questioning, the pressure increased. The consistency she had maintained began to weaken. Details that had previously been delivered with certainty became less precise. When confronted with discrepancies, she was unable to reconcile them with her earlier statements. The shift was gradual, but it was clear. She admitted that her original account was not accurate. She had not been present at the time of the transaction. The documents she had validated had been prepared in advance and presented to her after the fact. She had been paid to formalize them without verifying the circumstances under which they had been signed. Her admission changed the direction of the investigation immediately. The unified narrative that had been constructed by the individuals involved was no longer supported by credible documentation. The transaction could no longer be considered legitimate based on the available evidence. It had been staged. The focus returned to the remaining witness, the friend Ryan had identified as being present during the sale. His initial statement had aligned with the others, reinforcing the claim that everything had occurred as described. Now, that statement was directly contradicted. Investigators brought him in again, presenting the information obtained from the notary. The strategy was straightforward. They made it clear that the foundation of the story had collapsed. The expectation was that he would either maintain his position and risk greater consequences or adjust his account. The decision he faced was immediate, and this time the consistency that had held the narrative together began to break. The second interview with Marcus Hale did not follow the same pattern as the first. The consistency he had maintained earlier was gone. Investigators did not approach him with new questions. They presented him with the revised framework of the case. The notary had already admitted that the documents were staged. The structure that supported his previous statement no longer existed. What remained was his decision, whether to continue repeating a version that had already been disproven, or to provide a different account. Marcus did not respond immediately. The delay was not treated as resistance. It was recognized as calculation. He understood that the situation had shifted from a coordinated explanation to individual accountability. The agreement that had once connected everyone involved no longer offered protection. The offer from investigators was direct. Cooperation would be acknowledged. Silence would not. When Marcus began speaking, the narrative changed completely. He described how his connection to Ryan Walker had started years earlier, during a period when Ryan was already involved in criminal activity. Their relationship had continued after that time, built on familiarity rather than trust. In November 2024, Ryan approached him with a proposal that was presented as an opportunity rather than a risk. The plan involved acquiring a yacht, but not through a legitimate purchase. The objective was to take control of it and convert it into a financial asset. Marcus explained that Ryan did not initially present the full scope of the plan. The details were introduced gradually, framed in a way that minimized the reality of what would happen. By the time Marcus understood the full intention, he had already agreed to participate. Another individual, identified as Derek Collins, had also been recruited. Derek's role was described as reinforcement, someone who would ensure that the plan could be carried out without interruption. The meeting at the marina was never intended to finalize a sale. It was structured as a sea trial, a routine step in evaluating the yacht before purchase. Daniel Brooks, who had years of experience working within the justice system, immediately recognized something that did not align with his expectations. Marcus described a shift in Daniel's behavior at that point. The interaction did not follow the pattern Ryan had anticipated. There was hesitation, a reconsideration of whether the trial should proceed. According to Marcus, Ryan adjusted the situation in real time. He stepped away and contacted Ashley. Within minutes, she arrived with their young child. The presence of the child changed the dynamic of the interaction. The hesitation that had emerged began to fade. The situation returned to what appeared to be a standard transaction. The group boarded the yacht under the assumption that the process would continue as planned. Ashley did not remain. She left shortly after, maintaining the appearance that her involvement was limited. Marcus indicated that her role had already been fulfilled. The decision to proceed had been secured. Once the yacht moved away from the marina and reached a point where no external observation was possible, the plan was executed. Marcus described a sequence that followed a clear structure. Ryan and Derek directed Daniel toward the lower section of the vessel under the pretense of reviewing specific features. At the same time, Marcus remained with Melissa. The separation was intentional, prevented either of them from responding effectively. What followed was not described in detail, but its outcome was clear. Daniel was restrained. The same process was applied to Melissa moments later. Both were controlled, unable to influence what was happening. The situation shifted from deception to force without any intermediate step. Ryan then directed the next phase. Documents had been prepared in advance. Daniel and Melissa were compelled to sign them, transferring ownership of the yacht and granting access to financial accounts. Marcus noted that Melissa made an error in one of the signatures, leaving out a letter in her last name. He interpreted it as a deliberate act, though its purpose at the time was not fully understood by those involved. After the documents were completed, the situation did not de-escalate. Instead, it moved to its final stage. Marcus described the method that had been planned. The two victims were connected to a heavy anchor through restraints. The anchor itself was positioned to ensure that once deployed, it would not allow any possibility of recovery. The process required coordination between all three participants. Each had a defined role and each followed it. Marcus did not describe the moment as chaotic. He described it as controlled. The sequence unfolded according to the plan that had been established before they ever arrived at the marina. Once the anchor was released, the outcome was immediate and irreversible. Marcus stated that after this point, Ryan's behavior shifted. The tension that had defined the earlier stages was replaced by something else. The objective had been achieved. The focus moved from execution to departure. The yacht was redirected back toward the marina, following a route that did not attract attention. Communication with Ashley continued throughout the process. Marcus confirmed that Ryan had been in contact with her before, during, and after the events. She was aware of the plan from the beginning. Her role had not ended when she left the marina. It had continued as part of the overall coordination. The return to the marina was treated as a standard completion of a transaction. The yacht was secured. The staged narrative was implemented. The documentation that had been signed under coercion was presented as legitimate. The involvement of the notary ensured that it would appear valid under initial review. Marcus concluded his account by acknowledging his participation. He did not attempt to redefine his role. He did not minimize the outcome. His statement provided a complete framework of what had occurred, aligning with the inconsistencies that investigators had already identified. With his testimony, the case shifted from uncertainty to confirmation. The disappearance of Daniel and Melissa was no longer an unresolved event. It was a planned operation that had been executed with precision, concealed through coordination, and sustained by a narrative that had now collapsed. The investigation did not slow after Marcus Hale's testimony. It accelerated. What had once been a case built on inconsistencies was now supported by a detailed account that aligned with every unresolved element. The timeline, the missing funds, the falsified documents, the recovered belongings. All of it now fit into a structure that no longer left room for alternative explanations. Ryan Walker was taken into custody again, this time under charges that extended far beyond financial crimes. The shift in legal posture was immediate. The narrative he had presented earlier was no longer relevant. Investigators approached him with the full weight of the evidence now established through Marcus's cooperation. His prior admissions about illicit money no longer stood as a separate issue. They became part of a broader pattern that reinforced intent and planning. Ashley Walker was also brought in under a different framework. Her role, once presented as peripheral, was now central. Marcus's statement had made it clear that her involvement had not been incidental. She had participated in the planning, understood the objective, and contributed to its execution in a way that ensured Daniel and Melissa would proceed without resistance. Her earlier claims of limited knowledge could no longer be maintained against the structure of the case. Derek Collins, identified as the third participant, was located and arrested. His presence during the operation had been confirmed, and his role had been described with enough specificity to establish direct involvement. The group that had once presented itself as a set of unrelated individuals was now clearly defined as a coordinated unit, each member contributing to a plan that had been constructed in advance. Search warrants were executed at the Walkers' residence. The items recovered there did not introduce new questions. They confirmed existing answers. Personal belongings belonging to Daniel and Melissa were found among the possessions of Ryan and Ashley. These were not items that would have been left behind during a voluntary departure. They represented a connection that contradicted every earlier statement made by the suspects. Among the recovered materials was a video camera that had belonged to Daniel and Melissa. Investigators reviewed its contents as part of standard procedure, expecting to find recordings consistent with the couple's time on the yacht. The footage began as anticipated. It documented routine moments from their life on the water, reflecting the stability they had built over the years. Then the footage changed. The recording shifted to a different sequence, one that had been captured after the disappearance. It showed Ryan and Ashley in a separate context, engaged in their own life, using the same device that had previously belonged to Daniel and Melissa. There was no attempt to remove or preserve what had been recorded before. The transition from one set of recordings to another was direct, as if the previous content held no significance. For investigators, the footage did not provide additional evidence of the crime itself. It revealed something else, an absence of acknowledgement. The individuals responsible for the operation had continued their lives without interruption, integrating what they had taken into their own routine. As the case moved toward prosecution, Marcus Hale's cooperation became a defining factor in the legal process. His detailed account, combined with physical evidence and corroborating findings, established a foundation that could not be challenged effectively in court. In exchange for his testimony, his charges were reduced. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a decision that reflected both his involvement and his role in bringing clarity to the case. Ashley Walker faced a different outcome. Her participation, particularly her role in facilitating the initial trust that allowed the plan to proceed, was considered central to the execution of the crime. The court determined that her involvement warranted the maximum penalty available without the possibility of parole. She was sentenced to life in prison. Ryan Walker and Derek Collins were tried with the full scope of the charges presented against them. The prosecution outlined the sequence of events with precision, supported by testimony, documentation, and physical evidence. The defense offered no alternative explanation that could account for the established facts. The verdict reflected the severity of the actions that had been carried out. Both were sentenced to death, a decision that underscored the calculated nature of the crime and its irreversible outcome. For Daniel and Melissa, the legal conclusions did not alter what had been lost. Their absence remained permanent, defined not by the resolution of the case, but by the life they had built and the future they had planned. Their sons continued forward, carrying the weight of what had happened, while also holding on to the structure their parents had created. The transition into parenthood that had once been a source of shared anticipation became something different, an experience shaped by memory rather than presence. The story did not end with the verdicts. It continued in the lives that remained connected to Daniel and Melissa. Their decisions, their values, and the consistency they had maintained over the years did not disappear with them. They existed in the choices their family continued to make, in the way their sons approached responsibility, and in the way they understood trust. What happened was not the result of a single mistake. It was the intersection of intention and opportunity, where one group saw value in taking and another believed in the assumption that people operate within shared boundaries. The difference between those perspectives defined the outcome. In the years that followed, the case became a reference point, not only within the legal system but within the broader understanding of how trust functions in everyday life. It did not suggest that trust should be abandoned. It suggested that trust, like any other decision, requires awareness. Daniel and Melissa had built their lives on consistency, on the belief that effort and intention lead to stability. That belief was not proven wrong by what happened. It remained true in everything they had created and everything they left behind. What their story ultimately reveals is not just the presence of harm, but the enduring impact of how people choose to live before that harm ever occurs. The value of a life is not measured by the moment it ends, but by the structure it builds and the meaning it leaves behind for others to carry forward. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your attention and presence mean more than words can fully express. Stories like this are not only meant to be heard, but to be felt, reflected upon, and carried forward in the way we live our own lives. What we can take away from this story is simple, yet deeply important. Life is built on trust, but trust should always walk alongside awareness. The people we love, the choices we make, and the moments we often take for granted are what truly define the value of our lives. In a world that moves quickly and often unpredictably, staying grounded in what matters, family, integrity, and connection, becomes more important than ever. If this story has left you with even a small thought, a moment of reflection, or a feeling worth holding on to, that alone makes it meaningful. And if you would like to support our channel, it only takes a small action. Please consider liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future stories. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that matter. Thank you again for being here today.